thank you so much, Chris, for agreeing to give a nice introductory tutorial on the Ontology Access Kit, OAK. So just for some context for some of you, so we have a separate session on OAK planned on the 11th of April, I think it was, where we will go into some more kind of details around how the API is used. Today, we are kind of like doing a very broad stroke where Chris is going to do a very introductory talk to give you all an intuition of how OAK functions and how it can be used. So thank you very much for being with it, and take it away.
All right. Thanks, Nico. And thanks everyone for joining. My slides up. All right. Okay, great. Yeah. So this is about OAK, the Ontology Access Kit. And I've popped a couple of URLs in here if you want to take a look at some of the documentation and follow along. But yeah, basically, as Nico said, what we'll be doing today in this section is in three parts. So the first part, I will try and kind of orient us with some of the basic underlying concepts in OAK, and just point you towards some of the existing documentation, and go maybe just a little bit into some of the kind of philosophy of how it's organized, how we modularize some of the different kinds of operations. But the bulk of this will be essentially kind of like showing you some examples of the OAK command line. And the idea here is that anyone can with it, you can make use of the command line without really any kind of like programming abilities. There's a little bit of kind of technical expertise involved in just installing things and getting Python set up in your system, but ultimately you don't really need any coding to follow along in this part. And then we'll have just a kind of Q&A section, but this is also kind of a good time to just do additional kind of like live demos if there's particular kind of like queries that you've wanted to do over your favorite ontology. We can just you can just drop them in the chat and we can try doing some of those. Okay, so without further ado, let's move on to some of the basic concepts. As I said, this tutorial is aimed really at everyone who's using ontologies in some capacity or other. So this could be curators, it could be data scientists who are using ontologies for analyses. This could be database developers who are looking to kind of like have some programmatic way to interface with ontologies to build databases and so on. But today we'll be focusing on the command line, so you don't need programming abilities, but it will help maybe if you have some familiarity with some basic command line concepts. So we've been over some of these in previous obo-academy tutorials. If you're not familiar with these, don't worry, a lot of this you can kind of pick up as you go along, but it might kind of like help you if you've got just a bit of a background in just the Unix kind of philosophy of kind of like lots of individual small commands that can be chained together to do different things. And if in fact you're familiar with robots, you'll probably be familiar with some of these concepts as well. If you are interested in using OAK programmatically from your own Python programs, we will be doing, as Nico says, a follow-up on April the 11th, where we go into more detail on the Python interface. But if you want to kind of explore on your own, everything that we do today with the command line is really just a sort of thin shim layer on top of like the underlying Python interfaces, which are hopefully reasonably well documented. So speaking of documentation, like most well-behaved programming libraries, there's a GitHub repo for OAK, and like many such GitHub repos, there's a little link in the top right-hand bar where you can go to get to the actual the kind of the broader introduction and deeper documentation and so on. So the way we've organized the OAK documentation is there's a basic kind of introduction to some of the concepts, and we get right into a tutorial that you can kind of follow. Yeah, we won't be doing this tutorial today. We'll be doing a slightly different one, but you can always go to this tutorial and just try some of the commands in here. We're also working on the OAK guide, which is more of a deeper kind of exploration of some of the concepts underpinning Oak, concepts like graphs, URIs, queries, how things that we might think of as being simple, like what kinds of labels can be attached to kind of ontology terms, and can they have more than one label, and so on. They actually turn out to be a little bit more nuanced. We're sort of like gradually building up this guide, and it's intended to be very complementary to some of the existing obo-academy guides. What we're also striving to do is to build up a large library of examples in the form of Jupyter notebooks. So if you're a developer, you've probably seen Jupyter notebooks before. They kind of like show you little snippets of code and what the results are of running that code. What we've been doing in the Oak repo as well is actually making Jupyter notebooks that are just for the actual command line commands as well. So again, kind of like with little to no Python programming involved, it just kind of like shows you some examples of running Oak on the command line. And what we're trying to do is make an example Jupyter notebook for every single command that exists in Oak. But we're not there yet. We've only got example Jupyter notebooks for about like 8 or so of these. Okay, so just some of the basic concepts. So Oak is a Python library for performing various kinds of ontology-based access operations. It's organized as a modular Python package. So it comes, when one single kind of distribution on the PyPy package repository, but internally it's organized into different sub-packages, organized around different kind of like use cases and so on. So, developers and data scientists can use this Python layer. We're striving for kind of good documentation for every module and every Python method in here. So there's an example of the relationships method that can be used to query different kinds of edges or relationships within an ontology. But the other part of it is the command line interface that is aimed at really everyone. And there's about 50 or so different subcommands within this command line interface. But just to kind of give you the broad picture of some of the things that are possible with Oak, we've got these different sub-modules organized around different use cases. The most common one is this one up on the top left for just doing basic ontology lookup operations. So this is just find me all relationships that a particular concept like neuron has in the cell ontology, or find me all definitions for this set of terms. And it turns out a large number of the kind of operations that we need kind of day to day just fall into this kind of basic kind of ontology lookup category. But then there's some more advanced modules as well. You can do various kinds of things that we'll look at today that are organized around this concept of graphs. So you can kind of search for ancestors or descendants of terms and visualize those. There's a basic library for working with kind of ontology associations or annotations. So this is kind of things that, ways of associating things like genes to terms, such as Go associations or phenotype associations and so on. So there's various different operations for working with those. There's some kind of like text and natural language processing type operations where you can do things like annotate text or match ontologies together using kind of a lexical matching. Even though the emphasis on Oak is accessing ontologies and not so much on developing ontologies, we are starting to include operations for things like doing ontology validation. This includes things like structural validation of an ontology, making sure it conforms to ontology metadata standards, such as every term should have like maximum one label in any one language or maximum one textual definition. And there's also some the beginnings of some code that do validation on text definitions themselves to make sure that they conform to community best practices for defining terms. There's a library that there's a sub-package that deals with ontology changes. We won't be going into this today, but I think there's been previous tutorials on this on the ontology change language, and we're actually planning to have a workshop coming up in on May on the change language. So we won't be covering that today, but just so that you know, there are kind of like operations within Oak such that you can get both high-level diffs of ontologies and ways to apply changes into ontologies. There's some measures for doing some methods for doing semantic similarity measures, finding how similar two terms are, and for doing kind of like Go style enrichment analyses, but generalizing beyond Go onto other kinds of ontologies as well. And there's a few experimental plugins as well that allow you to do more things involving machine learning, kind of like using libraries such as size spacing. But just to kind of make this concrete, here's an example of a command. So using one of the kind of canonical Oak style operations is doing this kind of visualization of a term and its ancestors over a certain set of relationship types. So this is visualizing T-cell or memory T-cell within the cell ontology. And you can see also this highlights nicely how some of our ontologies connect together. So you can traverse up part of relationships going from leukocyte into the immune system, which is colored here in this is the Uberon ontology, which here is colored in yellow. And this is actually driven by a kind of flexible style sheet language so that you can customize these visualizations so that you can have different relationship types colored different colors, or different kinds of glyphs, different ontologies show up in different colors, and so on. So it's actually quite flexible. So one of the key features of Oak is it provides different common interfaces to multiple different backends. And so we'll get to the concept of what the different adapters or backends looks like in a moment. But the basic idea is that there's a set of interfaces. We've got the basic ontology interface for doing simple lookup operations, and then we've got other interfaces for doing more advanced kinds of operations. And different adapters or different backends can implement one or more of these interfaces. So what this means in concrete terms is that you can use Oak for either for local files or for remote endpoints. So some of the local files types that can be used are things like obo format, obo-graphs, JSON, OWL, functional syntax, and SQLite. Now there's some caveats here that I'll get to. But the basic idea here is that for many use cases, you've got some ontology file that has been downloaded locally onto your laptop or your workstation or whatever, and then you just want to use a local file adapter to access those files. But there's also ways to interface with remote endpoints as well. So this includes ontology browsers like BioPortal and OLS, Ontob, and also kind of like for endpoints that expose kind of powerful kind of like Sparkle queries like Ubergraph. These can be interfaced using Oak as well. So this kind of paradigm of kind of providing a unified interface on top of these different backends can be kind of very powerful and quite flexible, but there's a few pitfalls here. And not all operations are implemented for all endpoints. And sometimes just due to different behavior in some of these different endpoints, you might get slightly different results, which can be a little confusing. And there's a few caveats as well. If you're working with obo format, we use a library called Pronto under the hood, which is a very nice, very fast library that implements very strictly the obo format specification. And sometimes, maybe it's a little bit too strict, and it actually turns out that many of the obo files that we distribute in obo in the obo library aren't actually, strictly speaking, kind of like valid obo files, and then Pronto will kind of complain if you try and parse those. Another caveat is you can work with kind of like OWL serializers, RDF-XML, but we're using a library behind the scenes called RDFlib, which is a little bit kind of like slow to kind of like parse some of our larger ontologies. The same goes for the fun OWL library that we use to parse functional syntax. So the TLDR here is, for most use cases, your best bet is to use the SQLite backend. And so you can actually, you don't even have to, SQLite is, will be sort of like, you don't need any kind of like separate installations here. If you just, install Oak, then they should all work. And you don't even have to kind of like worry about manually downloading or building SQLite files. If you just type this command that is at the top here, where you pass in as an argument SQLite obo-cl, for example. It will behind the scenes take care of downloading a ready-made SQLite database of the cell ontology. We've got these for almost all of the ontologies in obo. There's a few that aren't strictly kind of conform to RDF XML that we don't build these for, but for most of the main ontologies, this is ready-made and ready constructed. And 99% of the time, this is probably good enough for what you what you want to do if you're using just existing public obo ontologies. If you like, though, you can also kind of like just point oak directly to a SQLite file. And then if you're working with, say, a version of an ontology that is a pre-release version and it doesn't have a ready-made SQLite file, there is a way to have oak kind of automatically compile that into SQLite. The caveat here is this does involve a few additional dependencies. So there's a kind of tutorial on how to do this. But the short story is we're going to be making this part of the process easier. And so if you are working with kind of like, say if you're a curator working with, say, the edit version of an ontology, it's maybe a little bit more painful at the moment. But for all other use cases, your best bet is to just use the ready-made SQLite versions. But just to kind of paint the bigger picture, here are all of the different other adapters for working with local files. And some of the adapters for working with remote remote endpoints as well, such as the OntoPortal family of ontology portals, bioportal, agroportal, OLS, OntoB, UberGraph. And there's even some bindings for Wikidata, but there's some caveats there. Wikidata will kind of cut you off if you try and do too many queries in too short a time. So this just gives you some examples of how you can swap out some of the the different endpoints, and again with some of the caveats. I think looks like there's a typo here. I think some of the ontologies like that we distribute, like Kebi, again may have some of these obo format syntax errors. But again, just using the SQLite is often the fastest and the easiest thing to do. So just one more kind of key concept before we dive into some specific examples. So Oak has a very pluralistic approach to different kind of data models and standards. Our perspective is that there's not going to be one kind of like universal, all-encompassing ontology standard. Depending on what it is you want to be doing. There's maybe different kind of like different data models for that. So an example that many of us are familiar with is the SSSOM standard, which is compatible with ontology standards like OWL, but it gives you a kind of like perspective for working with mappings that kind of exposes a certain set of properties that just makes it easier to work with mapping. So we take that general idea and we generalize it for some other use cases as well. So there's a data model for ontology changes called KGCL. There's a data model for semantic similarity, a data model for kind of like summary statistics over an ontology for taxon constraints and so on. And so each of these is represented in its own distinct data model within Oak. And all of these data models are backed by a LinkML schema, which gives you multiple different serialization for data expressed in the data model, from YAML to TSV to RDF. It also gives us kind of Python data classes for the data models and kind of full, complete documentation as is shown on the right here. All right, so with that, we can dive into a demonstration of some commands. Again, most of these are using the SQLite backend. They should all work in exactly the same way. If you want to try these later on, or as we're going through these, if you do have Oak installed already, it can be a bit distracting to kind of maybe try and follow these, do these as we're going through these. But if you do want to try, if you're already kind of like familiar with installing Python packages, just doing a pip install oaklib should give you everything that you need, and it should put the Oak command line on your ready to use on the command line. So Yeah, and if you are interested in actually contributing to the Oak project and you're a developer, you can actually clone the repo in GitHub, and we use a kind of poetry type environment for doing everything. So you can follow along that way as well. But without further ado, let's move on to just some of the basics of the Oak command line. So this is the anatomy of an Oak operation on the command line. So there's one kind of like universal global command that is just called run Oak. And then we have what we call kind of like subcommands, or just the main command. And so in this example, we're using the Oak relationships command. So this idea of kind of commands and subcommands should be familiar to you if you've used systems like Git and so on. But one thing that kind of can occasionally trip people up is this kind of like distinction between the global options, which go before the command over here, and then options and arguments that go after the command. So what I've highlighted here in yellow are the global the global options, and then we've got the arguments here on the right. So in this particular case, we're asking for all relationships around a particular Go ID. In this case, this is the Go ID for the concept of the cell nucleus. And so this one of the key global options is what we call the input selector. And so this comes after the -i. In this case, we're selecting the gene ontology using its kind of like obo code, which is Go, using the sqlite selector, indicating that it is in a ready-made obo ontology. So if you run this, the default output for this command is a TSV, and so it'll essentially give you a table of all of the different relationships for emanating from this particular concept of the nucleus. So you can also, with most Oak commands, you can kind of substitute these IDs for labels. If you haven't memorized every single numeric ID in your ontology of interest, which applies most of the time, then you can just kind of like plug in a label as well. The one caveat there is, so sometimes labels may not be unique. By default, it will also match synonyms as well. So if I was to do this kind of query here, it might also kind of give me all relationships for the neural nucleus in Uberon, because nucleus is included as a synonym here, and we're actually looking at the kind of Go plus version of Go here, which includes subparts of other ontologies such as Kebi and Uberon and so on. So that's the it can be convenient to work with labels in this way, but there's a few caveats, and we'll get into ways of doing more precise queries later on. So again, going back to the input selector highlighted in yellow here, all commands should essentially work in roughly the same kind of way. You just can just swap out different ontologies. In this case, we're doing the same structure of query, and this time using the cell ontology, CL, and we're querying for relationships emanating from neurons and so on. So and this just shows that we have a common structure across these different commands as well. In this case, we're not asking for relationships; we're asking for textual definitions of the nucleus. And the structure of the command is, essentially exactly the same. You can give it the same kinds of arguments, just with the previous one. You can use the labels, you can use the IDs, and so on in exactly the same fashion. And so we've got a lot of this uniformity across different commands. So if you if you learn some of the patterns for one command, it's not the case that you have to learn an entirely different set of patterns for new commands, because we try and have as much uniformity across them as possible. So this shows some examples of just other kinds of lookup queries, looking for definitions, labels, doing tree visualization, finding all descendants. So we'll get to some of these commands in a moment. So as well as just being able to provide individual IDs or labels, you can actually specify term lists. So in this particular case, we've provided 3 different Go IDs that we're asking for relationships for. and I think nucleus, membrane, something like that. You can also pass in a list of labels as well. And in this particular case, it will look up all relationships for the concept of nucleus and all relationships for the concept of membrane, doing individual, by default, it'll treat the list of terms as a disjunctive query. So it will do essentially an OR of all of the terms that you do. So one thing that maybe, so this example just shows the results of doing this kind of query. And again, oh, sorry, the right side of my screen is blocked here. So so this is nucleus, membrane, and cell. And it turns out the string cell actually matches a number of different concepts in different ontologies that are included in the imports here. So you can see quite a few different results of the relationships command there. One thing that maybe catches people out if they're not used to using the Unix command line is that each space delimited token is treated as a separate argument. If you want to kind of make a query with a particular string, so rather than saying nucleus or membrane, if you want to actually query for a nuclear membrane, just enclose these in double quotes. So this kind of maybe trips some people up, but this is fairly kind of like standard kind of like usage of command line arguments on Unix type systems. So as I mentioned, there's both kind of like command line options as well as global options. So an example of a global option is the verbosity command, where you can give, say, -v, -vv. This is mostly used for kind of like debugging to actually see what Oak is doing behind the scenes. But it's just an example of a kind of a global option that goes before the main command, in contrast to a command option, which goes at some point after the command. So in this particular case, we're actually passing in a flag to the relationships command that says, okay, only traverse the is-a and part of relationships here. And in this particular case, this is indicated using a double dash followed by the keyword predicates. But most of these options, and in this particular case, we're making use of what we call relationship type shortcuts or codes. So here, like the letter I indicates the is-a relationship or RDFS subclass. P indicates the part of relationship before number 50. There's also a few others like T for RDF type and E for L equivalent class. Some people prefer a style in which they always write out things explicitly. I tend to be lazy, so I like using some of these kind of like shorthand options. And it turns out for many ontologies like Go and the Cell ontology and Ubron and so on, just this ability to kind of like filter queries by is it and part of relationships is such a common use case. It can be very handy to do these kind of shortcuts, but it does maybe make some of these examples just look a little bit more opaque when you start using them. So in this particular case, specifying this filter will only show the is and part of relationships. And again, it's the idea is that even though this predicates option is specific to the command, we make use of the same patterns again and again. And if you run the same thing with the viz command, then it will give you a graph visualization of the nucleus concept, but again, only traversing over the is and part of relationships. And these same shorthand codes are used by default in the actual graph visualization as well. So you can see the edges labeled with I or P. Again, this is all completely configurable, but this is the standard defaults that we're trying to encourage here. So many of these can be shortened as well. So you can use the minus P option as an alternative to fully spelling out dash predicates every time. And again, that's largely a matter of preference, whether you go with the more verbose or the contracted option. But we'll mostly be going with the kind of shorthand options here. So by default, all oak commands will just write out to the onto the console directly. But if you like, you can use the output option to specify a path where the output should be written, and you can use the -O or -- output type option to specify a different serialization format. So in this case, as an alternative to getting TSV output, you can get this in YAML as well. And this can be useful for some of the oak commands that give more kind of complicated outputs. You know, the nice thing about YAML is it works very well for kind of like more complex nested data. Yeah, the same thing, you know, you can get output in JSON. So in addition to just being able to pass in plain identifiers and labels, you can also pass in lexical queries over the ontology as well. So I won't go into the full syntax for these today, and some of this is still kind of like you know expanding based on your own kind of like input of what kinds of things are useful. But this is just an example of a common kinds of query you might want to do, where this is, rather than searching for labels or synonyms that exactly match the string nucleus, this is doing a partial match. So this will get us everything in the ontology that includes the string nucleus. So there could be quite a lot of different matches to that. A different common kind of query pattern is where you query on the ID using the I code. And then the little hat symbol indicates that you're looking for IDs that start with geo colon. So this can be very useful for many of our ontologies which bundle with them parts of other ontologies as well. And often you want to do, okay, I just want to get all the native cell type terms from the cell ontology, or all the native Go IDs from Go. So this relates to a concept called base ontologies that you'll be hearing more about, I think, in some of these different sessions. So in addition to these kinds of lexical queries, you can also pass in more complex kind of like graph-oriented queries as well. So in this particular case, we're passing in a query function where we're asking for all descendants of the concept here, of the concept protein complex. So in the way the anatomy of the command here is that you have a long set of query arguments, and anytime one of these query functions, like descendants indicated with the leading period here, which can be optionally parameterized, again using the kind of same kind of like shorthand options here. So here we're saying get everything that is a descendant over the is-a relationship type of protein complex in the Go. So this essentially gives us all protein complexes in Go. And you can actually combine these together in a Boolean fashion. So in this particular case, what we're saying is get everything that is a protein complex, and at the same time, that same ID has to be and is our part of descendant of the concept of plasma membrane. So in other words, find all protein complexes that are part of the plasma membrane, and this should give you lots of these kinds of complexes here in Go that are typically kind of like receptor complexes and so on in the plasma membrane. And so this is actually heavily inspired by if any of you were maybe editing ontologies about 10 years ago, there was a tool called obo-edit that had its own kind of like query language kind of similar to this, with a kind of a visual editor that turned out to be very popular with a lot of people working with some of these ontologies. So we decided to actually resuscitate some of the concepts from this kind of obo-edit query language here. So this is, if you're not, this seems a little bit opaque, don't worry too much about this. This is more of a an advanced use of Oak. But it turns out once you master some of these kinds of Boolean queries, then it allows you to do a lot of things that would previously have taken quite a bit of programming expertise. So it can be very handy to do this kind of thing. Another more advanced operation you can do is you can essentially pass through complex queries. Again, the query language depends on what endpoint you are using. So if you're using something like ubergraph, you can pass in a Sparkle query. But in this case, we're querying the SQLite backend. And if you're familiar with the kind of like the SQL table and view structure underpinning the semantic SQL schema that we use for these ontologies, then you can do some quite powerful operations by essentially kind of like chaining together some of these SQL operations. So this is essentially doing the same thing as the previous query, but doing it maybe more explicitly with the SQL query. So getting things that are all entailed, kind of indirect subclasses of protein complex that are part of a plasma rendering. So it will give you roughly the same results. So if you didn't follow all of that, don't worry. There's always help at hand in Oak. You can essentially pass in the a -- help option for any individual command, and it will give you some documentation on that command and kind of give you some examples. So it's designed to really kind of facilitate more kind of exploratory usage like this. And as I mentioned earlier, we're starting to include Jupyter notebooks for each command that kind of like goes through maybe more advanced usage of each command. So this is an example of the notebook for the relationships command, showing some of the things that you can do querying the Uberon ontology here. So another useful operation if you're working with mappings and ontologies is the mappings command can be used to extract all mappings for example, for individual concepts. So here we're getting all mappings for Go ID number 10, which is trans hexaprenol transferase activity, and here we're asking for all mappings returned in SSSOM TSV format, and this is just pulling the mappings that are distributed with the gene ontology, which are currently all DBXref mappings, and you can see there's mappings to EC, to metapsych, to the RHEA database, and so on. Now, most of the time when we include mapping information within an ontology, it's slightly impoverished with respect to the full SSSOM model. But we are gradually working to remedy this and to include richer metadata about mappings directly within ontologies. So as we start to do this, you should expect to see more richer information when running some of these SSSOM mapping extract commands. So as well as being able to pass in the native ID here as well, you can actually do the reciprocal query and say, okay, if I'm querying Go, what are all the mappings for a particular EC number, for example? And so, this gets you the same Go number 10, transhexaprenol transferase activity again. You can also, just like all other Oak commands, you can pass in queries rather than individual IDs. So in this particular case, we're asking for all descendants of transporter activity in Go. Find me all of the mappings for those. And in particular, I'm passing in a command option here where we say I'm particularly only interested in mappings to RHEA IDs. So all RHEA mappings for all transporters within the Go. And if you just want all mappings, you can just basically leave the argument list off, and it will essentially fetch all mappings. Another useful backend is the NCATS translator SRI node normalizer backend. So this backend, its job is just to do mappings essentially. So this is not a useful backend to use to do most ontology lookup operations, but it is very useful for being able to dynamically map different kinds of entities. So in this particular case, even though we don't have an obo ontology for HGNC, it's present in the node normalizer. So here you can query just all mappings for, in this particular case, the FGFR3 gene, and again get back the results in SSSOM format. Some of the other bioportal is also quite a rich source of diverse mappings for a very, very wide range of ontologies. So this can be quite useful as well. Again, just switch out the input selector for BioPortal. And in this particular case, it's showing all of the mappings in BioPortal for a particular concept within HPO. So what if your favorite ontology doesn't have the mappings that you need, and you've got, say, a new ontology that you want to align? So maybe you want to align some new brain atlas that's distributed in AL format with the brain structures in Uberon. So you can just use the oak lex-match command to do this. This command has its own rich subset of kind of options and configurations and rules that you can pass to it, but just using the default options will give you a fairly kind of like decent kind of like first pass at a set of lexical matchings in SSOM format. There's other kind of similar commands, not for doing kind of like pairwise alignment, but for essentially doing text annotation. So let's say you've got an abstract that you want to annotate. You can just basically use the oak annotate command with any ontology. Here we're using it with obi, and here we're asking for to do all extract all occurrences of obi concepts in this text. So in this case, it's matching just little substrings like T-cell, but also longer strings such as T-cell epitope assay from the text. And again, you can do this using different backends. In this case, we're using the BioPortal annotator to annotate the same string with a wider range of ontologies. Let's say in the interest of time, I'll maybe kind of like skip over some of these commands, such as the dump command. But some other useful operations include doing semantic similarity between concepts. Here we're asking for semantic similarity between two concepts in the cell ontology, interneuron and astrocyte. And this uses another common pattern here, where we've got two term lists that are separated with this @ symbol separator. And the default output here is in YAML. So this will kind of give you essentially a couple of different similarity scores, Jacquard similarity, ancestor information content. And it will tell you in this particular case the way in which these two concepts are similar. In this case, they're similar by virtue of both being neural cells. So even though an astrocyte is a glial cell and not a neuron, they are, as far as the cell ontology is concerned, both neural cells. And you can actually pass in kind of like lists of terms here, and it will do kind of like all by all semantic similarity calculations. So this next example shows why some of the relationship type parameterization is useful here. So, if we enter two terms here that maybe are seemingly, somewhat different, like enteric neuron and melanocyte, maybe surprisingly, we'll actually get a high similarity score between them. And this is because they're related by not by the fact that they are pre-migratory neural crest cells, but by a development from relationship to a pre-migratory neural crest cell. If indeed you were to do the same command, but constrain it to only use ISA relationships, you would get a much lower similarity score between these, because the concept that they have in common is the fact that they are both somatic cells, which is a very, very high level concept within the cell ontology. So again, you can exercise more precise fine-grained control here using the develops from relationship as well, and then this will kind of give you this can kind of give you more meaningful ways to kind of like group these other than just simply going up the ISA hierarchy. So just very quickly, I'll show you some examples of doing queries using gene associations or disease associations. So in this case, we're going to download from the human phenotype ontology the HPOA annotation file. So these are annotations between disease IDs. In this case, we've got some OMIM IDs and HPO concepts. So basically telling us what the typical phenotypic features of a disease are. So we can actually use this to do queries over associations. The inputs get a little bit more complex here because we want to pass in the human phenotype ontology as an argument, but also pass in an association file as well. And there's no one universal standard for formats for association files. So in this particular case, we're saying use the HPO association file format and get me all associations to ataxia or to an is a descendant of ataxia. So again, showing how the predicates option can be used universally across a number of different commands. All right, so we're going to put this together and do an example of an enrichment workflow. So just for those of you who are not familiar with the kind of concept of gene set enrichment, this is a very common operation for ontologies like Go and Uberon. And the basic idea is that you've done some kind of experiment, you've got a big list of upregulated or maybe downregulated genes, and you want to understand what all these genes have in common. In other words, which ontology terms characterize those genes. But you can do this in OAK, but you're not restricted to gene set enrichment. You can do this for anything that you have an annotation file for, which includes things like the HPOA disease to phenotype annotation file. So just to kind of like, give an example of kind of like building up a more complex pipeline, let's just say we're starting with the Mondo ontology, and here we're asking for all descendants of a particular concept, like Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And because I'm lazy, I just typed EDS. If I was doing this in an actual production pipeline, I might use the actual ID here just to kind of be sure that I'm getting the correct concept. But just for illustration purposes, this shows how you can just kind of like plug in kind of like convenient synonyms here as well, so long as they're unique. So if I run this command, I get all of the different subtypes of EDS within Mondo. But let's say I want to take these and I want to normalize all those Mondo IDs into OMIM IDs where there exists an exact match. So here I can use the normalize command, and I'm passing in an argument to map these to OMIM, and then I'm passing in to the normalize command my EDS descendants query, and this will give me a big list of OMIM IDs as is shown on the right hand here. So finally, let's move on to the full pipeline here. So this is something you might want to split into two separate commands. So here we're running the normalize command to get all the OMIM IDs for all of the different subtypes of EDS, just redirecting this into a file called omim.txt. And then as a next step, we are running with a different ontology, the HPO, the enrichment command. And again, here we're kind of like passing in as arguments the omim txt file, and the -u argument here is essentially passing in the equivalent of a gene list, but in this case it's a list of disease terms. So we're basically saying what are the phenotypes that characterize Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and not surprisingly, the top the most significant kind of result is hyperextensible skin, followed by abnormally lax or hyperextensible skin. If you were to pipe these results again through the oak visualize command, you would see that many of these are kind of like generalizations of other concepts. But this essentially kind of like confirms what we already know about EDS, that it's characterized by these kinds of phenotypes. All right, so to sum up, this kind of covered a lot of ground, so don't worry if not everything kind of like stuck the first time. Again, there's a lot of documentation and examples, and we're gradually building out some more of these how-to guides. And if you're interested in taking some of this and using it more programmatically, then stay tuned for the other tutorial we've got on the Python interface coming up on April the 11th. So just finally to kind of thank the many contributors to Oak, and if you're interested in participating either as a developer or as a user, you can come along and join us on our GitHub repo, and you can also find us on the Obo Slack in the Ontology Access Kit channel. With that, I see lots of questions in the chat. Sorry, I didn't get time to them.
No worries, Chris. Thank you very much. And before you answer any of these questions that I have asked, maybe just anyone else here that wants to speak up and just ask their question. So Manuel was asking about the aliases that you skipped over this one slide where you explained how to be lazy, but we shared the slide.
Yes,
well.
I'm sorry I skipped over that. I hope that thing still made sense. But yes, I was being lazy and just kind of using commands like cl and uberon, but there's a common pattern where you can just create an alias and say, cl means query, use the run out command with the cl as an argument.
All right, so maybe I will make a small start. So the one big question that I had that you answered a little bit in the end on the side was, so if we want to chain commands across backends, so basically you have something like, give me all the children of neuron, for example, from Uberon, but then get me all the mappings from Bioport. So this kind of like glue that puts these two things together. I guess that I caught it slightly in the end because you made some example like that. Is this like a common pattern? Like how would you recommend to do these kinds of bridges across backends?
Yeah, in those kinds of cases, I think the cleanest thing to do is to split it over two different commands. The way Oak works the best is if each individual command is really operating over a single kind of like endpoint. Now, it is possible to do things like to build, maybe using robot or something like that, build kind of like a mega ontology that combines all of your different ontologies together. But most of the time, it makes more sense to just kind of like split things out into separate commands and take the output from one and feed it in as input to another.
Thank you. Yeah, Manuel is asking for phenotype enrichment, does the statistics part work differently from gene enrichment, or is it all working the same way?
It uses exactly the same method. So it's by default, it's a simple kind of like hypergeometric test. There are various kind of like caveats that apply to that. We could go into the, there's a whole literature on, kind of like, bias and so forth in enrichment analyses. And there's been a lot of work done on what it actually, means, in a gene set enrichment. So, not so much on kind of like other kinds, the basic story is kind of like, be more cautious when interpreting p-values when doing something that's not gene set enrichment. It may not be as meaningful.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, so maybe if I can just follow up on the question. So because for us in POM-based, maybe it would be nice because people have published a lot of gene lists before. So if we have a way to have this gene list and to provide updated enrichments, especially with our phenotypes, that would be nice. And if there's just a matter of calling a command, feels quite reasonable to do something like that. But we don't really have much expertise on the phenotype enrichment part, so we don't know if maybe it would be the same. I mean, can we just use the same thing that we would use for a gene ontology or not?
I think so. And in this case, you're talking about enriching gene to phenotype. So your POM-based gene to FIPO. And I think that makes sense. I think you'd have to be a lot more cautious if you had like allele to phenotype associations, but I think just for gene to phenotype, you should be okay.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, I will pump another small one in. So a mild concern with the sort of remote access part that we sometimes have is that we have it's a bit untransparent how old the versions are of the sqlite :obo adapter. So do you have any kind of like plans on like how often does it do these update, and how long after a new ontology release is out can we expect that Oak picks up these ones when we're using this connector?
It's typically every week there's a new release of the SQLites, and the goal is to make everything as transparent as possible. So I didn't go into some commands, like there's an ontology metadata command that will give you, basically the header from the AL file, including the version IRI. So it should always be kind of like transparent. And the older versions are also available from the same kind of S3 bucket. So if you need to, you can kind of go back to older versions.
Excellent. That's very good to know. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, and lastly, then, and then we can call it a close. So for the predicates option, I'm assuming since most of the work that you're doing is based on these like sqlite implementation, which in turn is based on a transformation that involves relation graph. Mm-hmm. Is there a, let's say, so in your kind of view, basically we are querying the kind of inferred sort of content of the ontology, right? Mm-hmm. So would there be in theory a path to looking only at the asserted results? Let's say you don't want all of the kind of relation graph inferences to show up because maybe the ontology you're using you don't trust it fully, and it just does some weird materialization. Is there anything that you can do to just query the asserted structure of the ontology as is?
Some of the commands kind of like give you the option of including entailed but not entailed, but I think the question you're getting at is not really a concern, because when the SQLite, and sorry, this is a little bit nuanced for the last 2 minutes, but when we build the SQLite databases for each ontology and we run relation graph with very conservative options. So what this essentially means is there's no possibility of a stray axiom in an important ontology doing something that would cause a strange inference. We're essentially only using relation graph to get the formally correct kind of indirect relationships between concepts.
Gotcha. Thank you very, very much, Chris. This was excellent, and this will be a tremendous resource for future generations of Oak users. We will share it on YouTube, everyone, and from now on, everyone that wants to start with Oak, we will share this video as a good starting point. This was really, really nice, and clap, and right. See you all, and enjoy your LinkML hackathon.
Thank you all.